Welcome to the Stoicism Reframed podcasts. We are your hosts, Aaron Savage and George Rudge. Welcome back to the show. George, how are you today, mate?
Yeah, good morning, Aaron. I am very well, and I'm excited for this topic today. I think we've got a good one, and I think we've got some real good things to say about it. So, excited for this. How are you?
I am very well, thank you, mate. Yeah, all good. I'm also looking forward to this one. I think this is something that will give some real value today. So, looking forward to getting into it.
Fantastic. Well, in that case, best for you to tee off, mate. What is the quote of the day?
Okay, so this quote is from Epictetus in Discourses, and he says, "The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own." And so this quote is all about control and focusing on what we can and can't control and where we should put our attention. And it's quite a big one in Stoicism. It's one of the core concepts of Stoicism. So a bit of a big topic, bit of an interesting one for an early morning show. But what do you think, George? How do you interpret it? What do you like about it, dislike about it?
I'll be taking another sip of coffee during this to make sure I'm in peak performance for this. Like you say, big topic. Yeah, I think as a quote, there are quite a few from the Stoics around sort of control, making sure you control only what you can and sort of ignoring the rest. And I think for me, it's sort of something I try to do, and probably do more than say some of the other Stoic practices, if you like. I think this one's probably more ingrained in my psyche by now, and that's purely just because of how useful I found it. So we can go into a little bit around sort of our experiences and stuff, I guess, a little bit down the road. But initial thoughts, yeah, it's a great quote, and I think it really helps when you actually apply what it's saying. I think it can be very, very valuable. I guess sort of throwing it back to you, why did you sort of choose that this week?
As you say, it's one of the things where I reckon a lot of people are more familiar of this concept anyway, whether it's come from Stoicism or not. A lot of the time, if you're anxious or feeling some sort of way, then you hear about just focus on what you can do and then go from there. So I think that's part of the reason. And again, just in general, about the whole idea that it is one of the most core concepts of Stoicism, and also trying to just dive into it a little bit more, trying to understand it and pick it apart a little bit, because I think that's something that we could really do with this quote, which is what I quite like about it, to really see where we both come from.
Yeah, okay. So I guess I think generally, if we sort of look at control, the sort of control aspect within the quote, I think generally, we have control over perhaps more than we sort of give ourselves credit for. That's sort of my opinion. I think sometimes you can end up reading this quote, interpreting sort of this Stoic principle, and almost residing to a place of helplessness, if you know what I mean, and be like, okay, well, there's so much outside of my control, so I can't do anything about it. And I think the inverse is true. So I think actually we control more in our lives than we sort of give ourselves credit for, whether that's directly or indirectly. So I think certainly for myself, I look at every situation and say, for example, something goes wrong. The first question I ask is like, right, okay, well, could I have done anything different? And if the answer to that question after once or twice of asking it is no, but like a genuine no, was it due to the way I sort of posed a question? Was it due to the way I interacted with someone that they sort of gave me that reaction or something along those lines? If it is genuinely no, exactly as the quote says, I mean, move on. It's outside of your control. There's nothing you can actually do to affect that situation. I think sort of somewhat a classic example of this, and I know that we've both had experiences with this, as I'm sure sort of everyone has who's listening, but for example, like loss or illness within sort of family and friends and that sort of thing, there is, to a large extent, well, hopefully to a large extent, nothing you can do to actually affect that, unless you're out there like knocking off your relatives, which I hope none of you are. Like, there's nothing you can actually do to affect the outcome of that situation. So I think it's important in that situation to not sort of hold yourself hostage and to actually realise that, yeah, you couldn't have done any more. So take that for what it is and sort of take that forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, mate. I think what you're saying is kind of fleshing it out a little bit more. And off of that point, I do just want to kind of expand and read another small quote from Epictetus. I say small quote, not really many of my quotes are small. But what he says is, some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. So that's kind of what the Stoics think about it. And that ties in somewhat to what you were just saying. But it also, in my opinion, shows that gap a little bit between how the ancient Stoics used to think, which is quite black and white, really, of this is what you can control, that's on this side, this is what you can't control, that's on this side. Whereas really, there is that grey area, which is what you were just mentioning, which is there are some things you have a little bit of control on. It's not as simple as, do I control it? Yes, no. It's, well, I can influence it. I can do something. Maybe if I look back, there was a tweak I could have made or something along those lines. And for us right now, I think of the podcast. So we can't control if people actually listen to it. If people choose to listen to it or not, that's not under our control. However, what is in our control is how much work we put into it, how much we try and get it in front of people, and all that side of things. So as much as we can't specifically sit people down and say, listen to the podcast, that's not in our control. We can do as much as we can do to help that. And that is where that, for me, that grey area falls into it. And I guess for what you were just saying as well, about could I have asked different questions or something like that? What could I have done? Maybe slightly different. That's the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example, actually, just sort of to illustrate that. And you're right. I think that's exactly sort of what I was angling at, if you like. I think it is that sort of combination of there is huge sort of potential mental relief that can come from sort of this exercise, especially when you realise something genuinely is outside of your control that you have no control over. But then similarly on the flip side, you have to be a little bit more accountable and sort of take ownership over yourself and your actions. And you'll learn some hard truths by realising actually how much ownership over stuff you do have, but it'll make you a better person for it, I think. I think there's you often see it where, through whatever situation it may be, sometimes people just let the world impact them in every way. I'm sure we can probably all think of sort of one person or few people in our lives that are completely almost at the mercy of what happens to them in their life. And I think that is almost the antithesis of what this quote is looking at. You do have control over the sort of aspects of your life. And I think if you can get to a point where you're taking ownership and accountability of the things you genuinely can control in your life, I think it can give you a lot more direction. And you're not going to be at the whim of, I guess, other people's actions, and you're not going to let them affect you as much. I guess without sort of going off too far, I think this is probably one of the key Stoic virtues that allows us to keep that sort of stable mood, if you like, that we've sort of spoken about in historic episodes, where you're not getting too elated and you're also not getting too low. So I think it's a real key one to take forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you say there about not being too high, not being too low, when you do just focus on what is in your control, I think that's what they're trying to kind of say is you shouldn't get pushed in either direction too heavily. So if you're just focusing on what you can do, then you're on the right path. You will be kind of eventually getting where you want to be, hopefully. But even if something happens, you're not going to be too affected by it, because you realise, well, there's not anything I can do about that element anyway. That's not something that I can impact. So why should I get frustrated? Why should I get angry or anything like that? Because it's not in your control. So you cannot control what happens, but you can control how you react to what happens.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just something to ponder on for a little bit, you know?
Yeah. I have got actually a quote comes to mind from Viktor Frankl, but I'll lead on to that in a second, because I think it might take us down a slightly different route. I think just off the back of that, have you got any sort of specific examples, I guess, like in your life sort of recently, I guess, where you've actually implemented this and looked at what you actually can control and what you can't?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the things for me most recently, and we have also brought this up on a recent podcast, not in the depth that I'm about to say, but in the UK at the moment, the economy is very, I don't know, well, a bit up and down. It's not going great.
Mostly down.
Yeah, mostly down. I wish it started going up. But with inflation, all these types of things, typically we've recently started looking to buy a house. And it was as interest rates were rising, and trying to not stay or get stressed about that. That was a big issue that both myself and my partner were struggling with, because things are getting more and more expensive. You're trying to buy a house. It's, oh my God, how are we going to afford this? What if this? What if this? What if this? You can always ask, what if this? And make it so much worse. And it wasn't until I kind of stepped back a little bit and thought, whatever happens here, I cannot do anything about it. I have my point of, okay, no further. If it goes any further, we're not going to buy a house at this time. We will just wait.
Okay, right.
Because that's not in our control. What is in control is what I do. And that is my control, is sitting there and having that cut-off point, saying, this has now crossed that threshold, I'm out.
Nice.
I can still keep looking for houses in that time period. I can still keep talking to mortgage advisors and all these types of things. But what's actually in my control is that side of it. It's not what happens to the market. It's not what happens to interest rates. It's not what the government do. I can't really do anything about that. And so that for me is where most recently I've kind of had to take that step back, because I was getting too reactionary. I was getting too anxious by looking at what was going on and trying to think about what is going to happen and trying to predict the future. Whereas the future's not really, in some things, under my control. So I had to just look at what I could. What about you? Have you got anything?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I was sort of, when you were going through that, I was thinking, okay, well, I guess the thought in the back of my mind was like, no, you absolutely agree. You haven't got control over the interest rates. If you did, fantastic, unlikely. But I guess I was looking at it like, well, you do have control over sort of your earnings and affordability, I guess. But then when you said, actually, I've got the control over the decision to proceed or not, I was like, nice. Yeah. Okay. I didn't think about it in that manner, but yes, you absolutely do have the choice whether or not to proceed down that course of action. So yeah, great example. I think for myself, so my sort of day job is very client facing. So I have client meetings almost every day. My job is effectively, I'm sort of in an advice capacity for those clients. And a big part of that is looking at sort of my performance in those meetings, if you like. So when I had a meeting earlier in the week, and I was on a little bit of a roll going into the meeting, so I think I was a little bit lax, and I actually didn't perform, quote unquote, as well as I wanted in that meeting. Didn't feel like I had quite the same level of engagement that I normally have with the client. Our conversations around products and sort of where we sort of make our money didn't go as smoothly as sort of I had anticipated, and that was, upon reflection, completely within my control. Now, I don't have the control over that person and that person's decisions, but I do have complete control over how I come across, how well prepared I am for the meeting, have I looked through all their notes, etc. So I think that's sort of a key example for me, just purely from off the top of my head and from this week. Just focus on what I do have control over. And in that situation, I had control over a lot more than what I didn't have control over, I think.
Yeah, and that's really cool because I like how you've linked that to your day-to-day and everyday activities, because it's very easy to sit there and if something doesn't go right, just be like, well, that wasn't in my control anyway. I can't control what people do. If someone doesn't make that decision, okay, not my problem, because Stoicism says only focus on what's in your control. Whereas what you're doing is zooming in that little bit further to analyze yourself and your performance, your attitude, all those types of things, which are fully in your control. And I think that's the most important part here, is it's not just looking surface level. It is looking at the detail. It's going in depth. It's really digging into what is happening to differentiate those things of, yes, I can do this, or no, that isn't with me. So the end goal, as you say, if they decide not to make the decision and not to buy the product or whatnot, okay, so be it. But everything else leading up to that you influence, I will take ownership of that. I will learn from that as well, because I assume that's probably quite a big part of your reflection on it, is that learning of how you approach the meeting, what you should have done differently, and all those types of things, which will only then help you going forward, the business going forward. So there has these knock-on effects as well as just your mental state. It's not just about only worrying or thinking about what you can control. It's also having a positive knock-on effect on future outcomes and future results of for the bit or meetings for the business and for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you said there. And I think it links almost nicely back to, without going off on another tangent, if you like, because I know we've already spoken about it previously, but it's also upon that reflection, having a good idea of where you're actually trying to get to as well, and realising the actual where you're going towards, at which point you can realise what perhaps needs a little bit more control and ownership from yourself. But yeah, nicely dug into there.
And for anyone that doesn't really know what George is talking about there, that we spoke about goal setting and having your why and things last week in episode 5. So you can always go back and revisit that if what George was just relating to doesn't necessarily make sense or you don't know what he was talking about.
Perfect. I think that's an opportune time for me to slide in this next quote from Viktor Frankl, because we spoke about him last week. So this one will, I think, send us on a slightly different direction, but I think is definitely part and parcel of what we've been discussing. So the quote is, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Now, this is a little bit different, so we're not necessarily looking at that sort of control, not control piece. But I think what it does highlight is that we're not talking about the control piece. We're talking about what you're controlling your perceptions, I guess. So I think that quote, sort of why I wanted to bring it up today, it brings to mind 3 stages, if you like. So sort of how we actually interpret things. So you have, do stop me, Aaron, if I'm going on a bit of a ramble here.
No, you go.
So I see it as we have sort of three sort of stages to this. So you have what's actually going on in the outside world. And as we've spoken about, you may have control over that, you may not have control over that. And then you have actually sort of the bit in between, and that is what's going on in your head and your sort of perception. So the middle perception piece. And then finally, you actually have what that means to you. What emotional impact does that have on you? What sort of lasting impression does that make on you? And I think the key thing to highlight is, even if you don't have control over stage 1, for example, what's actually going on in the world, you absolutely have control over stage 2, that perception piece. So even if you have something you can't control, for example, interest rates, you sort of illustrated it beautifully there, where you don't have control over that. But upon reflection, you do have the control over the decision to proceed or not. And you also have the control over the perception of those interest rates. You're like, well, okay, those aren't actually in my control. So there's no point stage 3 being a huge emotional response out of proportion. It's a case of, right, okay, well, stability, this is fine. I can deal with it. I have control over the decision, and sort of go on. I guess any thoughts from you there, A, on that quote, or B, that rambling dialogue I've just spewed out there?
So I think what you've just done is you've broken it down very, very nicely in terms of how to actually kind of go about this process. But the full identification of those stages, that must take, if you're going to properly look at it in those 3 kind of elements, those 3 stages, it's a big task, is it not, to sit down and draw that out or write that out and think about each individual thing? It seems like it's quite a potentially taxing thing to do, to constantly have to sit down and think about that, or how do you identify with that?
I think and we may as well call this sort of tips and tricks, I guess. I mean, we're sort of getting into the realms of application at this point. I think you're absolutely right. I think that process can take time, but it's in proportion to the task or the problem you're looking at, I think. So something menial isn't going to take as long as something big. Something big that you're actually fundamentally struggling with, I think will take time, but I think it also should take time.
Yeah, it deserves to have that time dedicated to it to do that process.
Exactly. And I think the only way you buy true investment and true belief in what you're actually sort of saying to yourself is to spend that time and rationally think through it, because you're not trying to trick yourself here. You're just trying to look at things as it's not even alternative reality, a different reality, which is still true. It's just changing your mindset. But I think back to your point around this could be sort of laboursome. I think it's something that actually becomes almost automatic. I think once you start to look at things in life in what you can and cannot control and their impacts upon you, I think it's something you just carry on. And I think it's almost becomes part of your psyche. And I think it's just that part of building that resilience, you know?
Yeah, that speaks a lot. And I think that is something where, I don't know, it would have a much bigger impact on the way you live your life if it becomes part of just how you do things. But I guess for me at this moment in time that's not a smooth thing. It doesn't just happen automatically for me. I've been swayed before, as I was saying. I was getting stressed about the houses and stuff like that. It wasn't just like an innate kick in of, okay, well, let's not worry about that. Let's do this process. Think about what we can control, what we can't control, blah, blah, blah. So I think you're right. It just takes, the more times you do it, the more it will happen. And the more you're just familiar with the idea of focusing what's in your control as well. It will eventually just be a thought process that goes through your head for anything that does end up happening, you know? I guess for me, because it's not necessarily something that just happens automatically right now, I've got a little bit more of a process that I go through and that I find quite helpful. So for my, I guess, tip that I do would be I visualize it. So I will literally write it out, / draw it out, and I will draw 2 circles, like a bigger circle and then a smaller one in the middle. And I will then write down the problem that I've got at the top or how I'm feeling, and then break that down into those 2 circles of the outer circle is things I can't control and the things that aren't anything to do with me. And then on the smaller inside circle, it's what I can do, because then it kind of just, as I say, it visualizes the problem and it makes you realize, well, actually, all these things that I am worried about, I can't do anything about them. But this little circle here, this focused, hyper intense one, that's what I can do. And so that is what I need to dedicate my time to, dedicate my thoughts to, all that type of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think that's a nice way of actually going about solving those problems, if you like. Actually visualizing it, and that forces you. It really forces you to actually consider things as well, having to write it all out. But I guess something you often sort of bring up on this is that you can't expect yourself to be perfect at this every single time. I think as humans, we are innately emotional and innately respond in certain ways to certain circumstances, whether that's due to upbringing, whether that's due to even evolutionary forces, if you like. So you won't be perfect, and if you're trying to reach perfect, it won't get there. But what you can do is try and get a little bit better each day, I guess, which I think is probably the same with all of this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that goes, at the end of the day, back to our first ever podcast that we did, where we kind of spoke about why we're doing this. It's because we are learning this ourselves. Like, you find this a little bit more easier and it's a little bit smoother of a process for you, potentially, it sounds like. For me, it's still something that I'm working on and trying to do, which is why this is so useful to talk about, because it just gets different perspectives, gets different opinions, views, tips, hints, all that stuff on how we can both get better and hopefully, give the listeners some value and help them with this as well.
Absolutely. I think that's quite a nice way for us to close things out. And I think just off of what you were saying there, back to the first episode, and even back to the name of this podcast, I think this is very sort of topical, if you like. It's, I guess, something that we've had in the back of our minds since we've been creating this podcast, that it is important to perhaps reframe things in your life and look at what you can and cannot control. So I guess over to you. Have you got any sort of closing thoughts that you want to leave people with? If not, we will wrap up.
Yeah, no, nothing really from me in terms of thoughts about what we were talking about. As you say, this podcast, Stoicism Reframed, is for that reason. That's why we went with the name, was because we are reframing our thoughts and how we think about things with a Stoic twist. So I've really enjoyed this show. I've really enjoyed this to put things into perspective and see how my mind works, how your mind works. And yeah, hopefully get that. Have you got any closing thoughts before I close out?
Don't think so. Just likewise, I think it's been a really good episode for both sort of me and yourself by the sounds of it. And hopefully anyone who's listening has also got some good value out of this. If you have, drop a comment down below let us know your thoughts. That'd be fantastic. Likewise, if you've got any ideas for other episodes you'd like to hear us chat about, feel free to drop us a message or a comment. Similarly, if you could like this, share it, leave a review, whatever you can do on sort of where you're listening, that'll be fantastic. Hopefully, if you've got some value out of this, that will just help us reach more people and hopefully provide more value to people. So,
yes, please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff like you do on the channels. Perfect. Thank you very much, George. Thank you, listeners. We will see you next week for another episode of Stoicism Reframed.
See you next week.